Okay, so let's talk about World War II. We're in week 5. A few things. I want to discuss the question of neutrality, the social and economic implications of the war, and then we're going to finish with John Morton Bloom, an American historian whose work V was for Victory discusses American society, culture, and politics during the war. Now, we know prior to our entry in the war, Roosevelt had declared that he was a pacifist. He declared isolationism. He ran for president in 1940 under the banner that he would continue to keep the United States out of the war. And one of his famous quotes in November of 1940, "I say to you, fathers and mothers, and I will say it again and again and again, your boys will not be sent into foreign wars." Well, let's look at what was going on up to this point. And did Roosevelt, was he truly isolationist? Was he truly about staying out of the war? One could certainly argue against this. Now, isolationism in the United States, it's part of our history. We have just a few things. The Monroe Doctrine, for example, keep Europe out of the Western Hemisphere. That did make us a little bit more active on our side, but not in Europe necessarily. The United States, of course, geographically isolated from the rest of the world, bordered by oceans. And the United States could theoretically stay out of these wars, as they often did not directly affect the nation. Our boundaries, our freedom, our principles, etc. So really we were kind of cut out or made to be isolationists. That's certainly part of our background. But again, with World War II coming, the actions of Hitler in Europe, these various things, Japan's empire steadily growing, they are expanding at the mercy of others and taking others under their control. Particularly, we see this in China. We'll get to that a little bit later. But again, these things are happening. The United States is claiming neutrality, but were we truly neutral? And there are a couple of important questions really to consider also. Now, would it be okay for Franklin Roosevelt, the president, to want to enter the U.S. into war if the people did not want to enter war? Is it possible that the president maybe knew something or was aware of truths that the American people maybe did not want to understand, did not want to accept? Now, if the American people did indeed want to stay out of the war at all costs and would have punished a candidate via election, would it be okay then, again, for Roosevelt to make the necessary efforts to enter the United States into war? In a situation like this, is it okay to hand over power to the president to do such? And then you also have to ask, what if we had not entered the war? Now, 1940, again, Roosevelt runs for president, says he will keep American boys from going across the ocean to fight in these wars. But were we already at war? The Neutrality Acts definitely provided favor to Western Europe, to who would be our allies. The Fourth Neutrality Act, for example, rendered that belligerent nations could purchase war materials as long as they came to the United States to retrieve them and they paid cash. Now, this is called the cash and carry. But think about this for a minute. Britain controlled the seas. So if we are only selling to those countries that can come over and get their own items that they're purchasing, basically what you're saying is you're selling to the British. Now, in 1939, the German charge d'affaires in Washington, D.C. informed the German government that Roosevelt had actually informed people that he would go to war if the Allies were in trouble, regardless of what the people wanted. Now, prior to the 1940 elections, U.S. leaders in general saw Roosevelt as trying to get the United States into the war, despite his election promises. And we see that in the way that he interacts with Churchill. And again, we'll get to some of these things, but it is very obvious to those around Roosevelt that he, while he's claiming neutrality, he is not acting in that way. Furthermore, August 1940, the National Guard is voted into federal service for a year. In September of 1940, the Selective Service Act put that into place for 1 year, which would initiate a draft eventually. We have an oil embargo of Japan. And then we have the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, which provided supplies and raw materials to Allied nations only. Now, we also have some duplicity In August of 1940, the United States breaks Japan's purple wartime code. They could now read all recoverable wartime messages, and they sent this information all over the world except to Pearl Harbor. Now, there are many different theories about Pearl Harbor. Did Roosevelt set us up? And there are many ways to look at this. It's difficult to fathom a president actually welcoming an attack on United States soil just for the sake of getting us into a war. I know there are theories about that, about 9/11. I don't believe them, and I don't believe them about World War II with Pearl Harbor. Now, that said, there are some very interesting things to remember about Pearl Harbor. Most of our bigger ships, the more powerful ships, our carriers were not at Pearl Harbor at the time. Only our weaker items were. Now, again, that could be coincidence, but there's way too much to go into that to get to discuss here in this lecture. But I just did want to touch upon that because, again, if we're sending Japan's secret messages everywhere except to Pearl Harbor, what that might tell you. Now, in October of 40, Roosevelt got word to Admiral Richardson, who's commander-in-chief of the American fleet in the Pacific, that he wanted to establish a patrol of the Pacific so that Japan could not reach her supplies. This does not sound like neutrality. Now, Richardson talked him out of this. It was abandoned because he knew this would mean war immediately. Now, in 1932, so I'm going back a little bit here, naval maneuvers showed how vulnerable Hawaii really was. Nothing was done about this. Richardson informed Roosevelt the fleet was exposed and inadequate for potential war. What happened to Richardson? He would be fired eventually for this. But again, there's no buildup in Pearl Harbor after this information comes to pass. Now, I mentioned the oil embargo. We assist England and the Netherlands in this oil embargo of Japan, which is significant. And again, we are working with England, who is an ally, against Japan, who is part of the Axis. So say what you want about neutrality, but we're going out of our way to prevent Japan from obtaining the necessary supplies they need for the war. Now, we have in November of 1941, which of course would be a month before the Pearl Harbor attack, Japan tried to procure a no-war treaty with the United States. We refused. Now, if you're neutral and you're trying to prevent war, wouldn't you want to sign a no-war treaty? Many things to consider here. But again, that is something to take into account. Now, in November and December, and this is getting back to the discussion of Pearl Harbor, in meetings and Soviet communiques, there is apparent knowledge that Japan would launch a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. The administration did nothing. It had to show the American people that Japan were the aggressors. Thus, this would rationalize war. Now, again, this is a theory some people have, that Roosevelt welcomed the Japanese attack just so that we could get people on board with the war. Again, this is still questionable, knowing everything that we know. More fodder for that argument, which again I don't really buy. In Pearl Harbor, planes were grouped in circles with propellers facing each other, thus making it difficult to get them off the ground. Roosevelt asked for this in an attempt to prevent Axis sabotage. All aircraft carriers were moved out of Pearl Harbor. Less valuable battleships were left behind, the old and obsolete. Smaller, more mobile ships necessary for sea war also were moved out of Pearl Harbor. So again, these are some of the arguments that people make as to why they believe Roosevelt welcomed the attack. Now, there are many historians who argue otherwise and make the point that we did not know when this attack would come. We did have intelligence that Japan would attack Pearl Harbor. We didn't really do anything about it because we didn't know when. And we didn't really know if. And apparently there are many American officials who had kind of poo-pooed the fact or the idea that Japan would attack us. So some of it might be kind of a willing dissonance or a willingness to not believe that, and kind of this group of ideas to kind of prevent the belief in that. But again, there is knowledge that it's going to happen. There's just no sense of when or where. And even myself, not a huge Roosevelt fan, I have a hard time believing that he would facilitate an attack on the United States soil. So again, these are some things anyway to consider. Were we truly neutral? There are many reasons to argue that we were not neutral prior to the war, and there are plenty of reasons to argue that we shouldn't have been neutral. There is an old quote that says, "All it takes for evil to triumph is for good men to do nothing." Now, prior to the war, when we look at appeasement with Neville Chamberlain, one could certainly argue those good men did nothing, which allowed Hitler then to expand and ultimately take over most of Europe. Roosevelt, again, ultimately, he maintains his neutral stance, but in actuality, was he neutral? One other thing to consider, and this is the last thing, and then we'll move on to social and economic implications of the war, is that Roosevelt met with Churchill before American entry into the war to devise a plan on what to do after the war. Now, you're not making plans for after the war unless you know you're going to be in the war at some point. So again, it's very questionable how neutral we were. Now let's look at a few things. Economic implications, economic impact of World War II, and we're going to go through this very briefly, but there is full employment due to the wartime economy. We had to manufacture munitions for the war, not only for us, but for the Allies. This is significant because we are just coming off a decade of depression. And what helps to get a country out of depression? War and wartime production. Now, post-war, we have a return to what's called normal production. There's an end of uncertainty for business. There's no real consumerism during the war, but output would increase, unemployment went down, and folks had money finally. And this really comes to fruition in the 50s, a few years after we have this transformation, this transition from a wartime economy to a peacetime economy, because industry is still working hard, still producing many things. Some of these things are for civilian use, for consumption, but also we have an arms race that occurs after the war. And so this production of this industrial production of munitions, of planes, ships, etc., it continues even after the war. So in a way, I mean, the Cold War is a positive economically in some ways. This arm race, again, continues that production, helps maintain full employment, higher wages, etc. But again, there is that transition, and again, that's after the war. Now, again, more impact during the war. There are fewer tenant farmers. Those who previously worked in the agrarian situation moved to the cities to work in factories because, again, supply and demand. There is a demand for munitions. There's a demand for industrial production. These people, there's less demand for agricultural goods, especially with more technology making that easier. So they are moving to the cities, kind of similar to the end of the 19th century. We also see the rise of the corporate state, organized labor and big business and big government, increasing industrialization, and these groups would work together to maintain prosperity after the war. Social implications of the war. Now, these are many. First of all, we have women in the workforce, similar to World War I. In both the United States and in European countries, when the men go to fight the war, who is going to work in the industries? Women. Women take many of these jobs. And that is where we get the famous Rosie the Riveter image. And again, women take up industry jobs that were previously held by men. Now, when men return from the war, they take those jobs back. We also see there is significant change for African Americans. We have beginning of some integrated military units. And many people argue, and I would be one of them, that the experience of African Americans in World War II helps to foster and strengthen the civil rights movement after the war. And we see major changes in the late 40s and the 50s and especially the 60s. Part of this, again, is due to these integrated military units. We have the Fair Employment Practices Committee, which pops up, which eventually required all government contracts to have a non-discrimination clause. We have increasing integration in factories. African Americans moved from the South to northern industrial centers to work in these factories. But we also significantly have a group of African Americans who are fighting for the country in Europe, and they see a double standard. They're fighting for freedom for these European nations, and they are not enjoying these same freedoms. They are not enjoying the right to vote in many cases. They're not enjoying the full freedom, the full opportunity that the others are. So there is this hypocrisy, and there is recognition of this. You also have a sense of more white Americans are working with African Americans in Europe during the war, and so they too recognize that this change needs to be made. But it is significant, and this is really where the ownership of the civil rights movement comes into play, because again, these African Americans are fighting for freedom in Europe for others. they come home and they recognize we don't even have it for ourselves. We need to take action. And that initiates many things. One of these would be the Double V campaign. Double V stands for victory at home and victory abroad. And so this really helps to organize the civil rights movement, and we will see that strength pick up again throughout the rest of the 40s, but especially into the 50s and 60s. One negative social implication we see from World War II, the internment of Japanese. February of 1942, Japanese Americans from the West Coast, which was considered the most vulnerable area, were relocated to internment camps all across the country. Arkansas, Arizona, California, Colorado, Idaho, Utah, Wyoming. There is a sense that these Japanese on the West Coast will only assist a Japanese invasion, that they might be spies, that they are helping the Japanese Empire in its war efforts. Certainly this happened, but to a very, very small extent. But Roosevelt and his administration felt it was important to intern these Japanese. Now, I mentioned they did work with Japanese Empire, but we also see Japanese in the Philippines collaborating with Japanese troops there. We have Japanese in California who support Japan's war in China with the establishment of Manchukuo, which was when Japan took over Manchuria a decade before World War II began. Expanded into Manchuria, took over, and many Japanese in America support this. They support the expansion of the Japanese empire. So this is one unfortunate implication from the war. It's also notable that thousands of Germans and Italians were interned as well, some with their families taken away from them. For example, 58,000 Italians were relocated, not to camps, but away from war zones in California. So this internment did include Germans and Italians, other members of the Axis, but very minor, especially in contrast to the number of Japanese Americans who were interned. Now, on the home front, we have the standard rationing. People needed cards to purchase gasoline, coffee, sugar, dairy products, processed foods, coal, and firewood, even meat. And this would frustrate customers or consumers. And they would, in many ways, make up for it after 1945 when we have this national prosperity and people began to buy things. We've talked about consumption and consumerism, the culture of consumerism in the 1920s. It's way larger in the 1950s, but we'll get to that next week. Also on the home front, we have recycling. Metal, paper, rubber. These could be used by factories. And the kind of the moniker, the statement that went with that, get some cash for your trash. So people brought in their metal, their paper, their rubber, because the factories needed it. We have more investment in war bonds to fund the war. We have an increase in those on the government payroll. In 1940, there are 1 million Americans on the government payroll. By 1945, 3.8 million. Now, this obviously has something to do with Roosevelt and his machinations as president, but this will only increase, and the government workforce in America today, even larger than that. We have really moved away from the roots that our founding fathers had established. We also have propaganda. There are posters in support of the war, films, scripts had to be approved, cartoons. Everything was pro-America. Oftentimes you'd have anti-German, anti-Italian, anti-Japanese. You have these people portrayed in nasty ways in newspapers, in films, etc. But again, this is part of getting the American people to support. We have limits on the freedom of press. Now, one could ask, is this okay? Could this even be done today? And we do have some similarities today, but it's important to recognize that for many, there's a sense that censorship is important because you want to maintain support. You don't want this criticism of the government. George Roeder, his book, The Censored War, American Visual Experience During World War II, argued that actually the U.S. press was more free than other nations. Still, some certain images were withheld from the view of the public, but increasingly toward the end of the war, we see more truthful images shown. And what he argues, the more Americans see of war, the less likely they are to support it. Now, this is absolutely true. What happens in Vietnam? We have these images coming on the news every night, and people are growing increasingly anti-war. This publicity, we see that in Iraq, we see that in Afghanistan, and this certainly plays a role in anti-war sentiment. There is a quote from George Will, and after this we'll go on to the John Morton Bloom book, But George Will's famous quote, "If there had been television cameras at Gettysburg, there would be two countries. The carnage would have caused the North to let the South go." And this is absolutely true. When you look at the bloodiness of the Civil War, if those images had been publicized as much as what we see in World War II and later in Vietnam, people would have called for an immediate end to the war, without a doubt. So let's move on. John Morton Bloom. We're going to finish with this today. His V Was for Victory is a book about the American home front during World War II. Explored American culture and politics and how the two impacted each other. Now, key to understanding the war, according to Bloom, was FDR's necessitarian view. He focused on the war and doing whatever was necessary to earn victory and bring the boys home as soon as possible. His was a conservative approach to the war, and this would continue even after his death to the peace accords. Even after, as Americans did not believe it was their responsibility to reconstruct Europe. So we see kind of that go back and forth. Now, for example, Bloom points out, part of this necessitarian point of view, government worked closely with business. During the war, there was no free market, only a controlled market. Large businesses earned special privileges for their efforts. This is important. Hey, let's bring them into the fold. Let's give them special privileges, and they will help us with the war. Number two, we have an internment of outsiders, again, via Executive Order 9066, which leads to the internment in Japanese. Again, this is a belief, hey, we have to do whatever we can to minimize any kind of collusion between Japanese Americans and the Japanese Empire. A third example that Bloom points out, we worked closely with countries whose assistance we needed to help win the war. Roosevelt did not pressure England to open Palestine to Jewish refugees, for example, because he needed Arab assistance with war materials. So, hey, let's make friends with the Palestinians and see how that goes, because we need their oil. Now, we know what happens. Jewish refugees are not allowed into Palestine prior to the war, and we know kind of the implications of that, what happens. Now, included in Bloom's work is some discussion of the early civil rights movement. And I had mentioned this earlier. It is during this time that CORE originates. Now, CORE is the Congress of Racial Equality, and it begins its early acts of civil disobedience. This is also the Double V campaign, which I had mentioned, Victory at Home, Victory Abroad. African Americans served in the military as well and began to recognize the irony that they were fighting for freedom abroad when they did not enjoy it at home. Additionally, there are some integrated units, few, but some did work together, which placed some whites alongside African Americans for the first time. There was a realization that there were no differences. This opened up many to the idea of acceptance and full equality. Additionally, there was some sense among our allies that we were hypocritical for the reasons mentioned above. The U.S. claims to be the bastion of equality and freedom, yet a significant portion of the population was treated as second class. This is where we see the movement truly begin to grow, as I mentioned before. It had existed before, obviously, but now it began to grow and action was taken, especially with the acts of civil disobedience. We see those, again, after the war into the 50s and 60s. And in the next decade, again, the civil rights movement would grow exponentially. So we'll leave it at that. Enjoy the rest of the war, and we'll see you next week.